Before we begin tonight's story, tell me, where are you listening from? Drop it below, and if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that little bell. Now settle in, pour your tea, and let's begin. The ballroom at Marrow House was too warm, too bright, too full of people who had nothing better to do than watch each other for signs of weakness. Lady Jacinta Ashworth had learned, over 11 years of marriage, that this was the only skill society truly valued. Watching. Waiting. And when a woman slipped, saying so loudly with a smile. She stood near the long windows with a glass of ratafia she had no intention of drinking, and she counted the minutes until she could reasonably ask for the carriage. "You look tired, my dear," said Baron Reginald Ashworth, arriving at her elbow the way a draught arrives under a door, unwelcome and impossible to keep out. He did not look at her. He rarely did anymore, not properly, not the way a man looks at something he wants to remember. "I am well, Reginald. You are pale." He said it the way he might comment on the weather or a poorly set table. Then, because Lord Fenwick had wandered close enough to hear, and because her husband had never in his life passed up an audience, he added, "I do think grief has not been kind to your looks, Jacinta. A woman's bloom fades so quickly once it starts." The words landed the way a slap lands, not loud but complete. Lord Fenwick's mouth twitched with the effort of not laughing. Someone near the punch bowl went very still, the particular stillness of a person storing up gossip to spend later. 3 years. 3 years since she had lost the child that would have been a son. 3 years since the fever that followed had left her thin and grey for a full season, and he stood here now at a ball in front of Lord Fenwick and called it a fading bloom. As though grief were a fashion she had chosen poorly. She did not cry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not give this room the satisfaction. "How fortunate," she said instead, quiet enough that only he and Fenwick could hear, "that a woman's bloom matters so much less than a man's conduct. Yours, my lord, has been wilting for years, and nobody has once remarked upon it." Fenwick made a sound like a cough that had gone terribly wrong, and turned it into a fit of throat-clearing. Reginald's face went the color of old brick. He did not answer her. He never answered when she was quicker than him, only filed it away as one more thing to resent her for later, in the privacy of their cold and silent house, and he took himself off toward the card-room without another word. Jacinta let out a breath that shook only slightly. "That," said a voice at her other side, warm and entirely too amused, "was the finest thing I've heard said in this ballroom in perhaps a decade." She turned. She had not noticed him before, which was strange because he was not a man one failed to notice. Tall, dark-haired, with the sort of face that had clearly been handsome at 20 and had only sharpened into something more dangerous with age. She did not need the murmurs that had followed him into the room earlier to know who he was. Everyone knew the Duke of Thornhaven. Everyone also knew he did not attend balls, did not dance, did not make conversation with anyone he had not already decided was worth his time. "Your Grace," she said, dropping the smallest correct curtsy. "I wasn't aware anyone was listening." Everyone was listening. That's rather the point of a ballroom. He studied her with a frankness she found almost rude, if it hadn't been so entirely without malice. "Your husband is a fool. You mustn't say such things. People will think you have opinions." "I have several. Most of them are about your husband and none of them are complimentary." A faint smile. "Would you dance, Lady Ashworth?" "I don't think that would be wise." "No," he agreed easily. "It would be extremely unwise. Half the room is already deciding what they'll say about it tomorrow. I find I don't much care." She should have refused. She knew with the same certainty she knew her own name, that refusing was the correct and sensible course, that a woman in her position, married still, humiliated not 5 minutes past, could not afford to be seen dancing with the most talked-about bachelor in England. Sensible had been her whole life for 11 years. Sensible had gotten her a cold house, a colder husband and a bloom apparently that had already faded. "One dance," she said. "For the scandal of it." Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, something warmer than that. He offered his arm, and as her gloved hand settled against the dark wool of his sleeve, she felt the eyes of the room turn toward them like a field of flowers following the sun, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found she did not mind being looked at. She minded instead how it felt to be looked at by a man who was not counting her flaws. They did not speak at first once the music began, an old-fashioned choice, slow enough that conversation was possible, and he made no immediate use of it, only watched her with an attention that felt like being read thoroughly, the way Winifred Marrow had once read a girl's turned gloves and understood everything about her in a single glance. Jacinta was not accustomed to being understood. She found she rather liked it and rather feared it in equal and confusing measure. "You did not answer him," Thornhaven said finally. "Your husband. You cut him instead. Why not simply cry as I imagine he expected you to? Crying is what he wanted. It would have proven his point." She lifted her chin. "I have spent 3 years refusing to prove his point, Your Grace. I'm not about to stop for an audience." "No," he said again, softer this time. "I don't imagine you are." The music turned them slow, and for one unbearable moment his hand tightened at her waist, and she was aware, sharply, foolishly aware, of how long it had been since anyone had held her like she was something worth holding carefully. She looked up and found him already looking down, and the space between them seemed, absurdly, to have grown smaller than the steps of the dance required. Across the room, near the card-room door, Reginald Ashworth had turned from his hand of cards to watch his wife dance with the Duke, and his face had gone from brick red to something colder, something far more dangerous than embarrassment. Jacinta did not see it. She was too busy learning, one slow turn at a time, what it felt like to be seen. The morning after the ball, Jacinta's aunt arrived before breakfast had even been cleared, which was in itself a declaration of crisis. Lady Prudence Fairweather did not rise before 9 for anything less than scandal, war, or the discovery of a truly excellent piece of gossip, and by the look of her, bonnet askew, gloves still half-buttoned, she suspected it was all three at once. "You danced with the Duke of Thornhaven," Prudence said before she'd even sat down. "One dance, and now half of Mayfair is convinced you've taken a lover before breakfast." "I danced with him once, Aunt. I did not marry him in the churchyard afterward." "You might as well have, for all the talking it's caused." Prudence settled into the chair across from her, snatched a piece of toast from the rack with the ease of long practice, and studied her niece with the sharp, assessing eye of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlived every rumor ever spoken about her. "Tell me plainly, Jassy. Did you enjoy it?" Jacinta opened her mouth to say something proper and careful, the sort of answer she had given for 11 years to every question that mattered. Instead, to her own surprise, the truth came out before she could stop it. "Yes," she said. "Dreadfully." Prudence laughed, a short, delighted bark of a sound, and reached across to pat her hand. "Good. Then you're not entirely dead in there after all. I was beginning to wonder, watching you go quiet and grey these last years, whether Reginald hadn't managed to bury you along with that poor child." The words should have hurt. They didn't, not the way they might have a year ago. They simply sat there, plain and true, the way blunt things sometimes were kinder than gentle lies. "He is still my husband, Aunt. He is your husband the way a millstone is a necklace. Technically attached. Not remotely an ornament." Prudence bit into her toast. "The Duke, on the other hand, has apparently spent this morning sending flowers to 3 separate addresses, trying to guess which one was yours. My footman tells me Lady Cavendish received an enormous arrangement of white roses meant, quite clearly, for you, and is telling everyone it was for her." Despite herself, Jacinta laughed. A real one, rusty from disuse, and it felt strange in her own throat, like a door opening after long years shut. "He doesn't know where I live?" "He knows precisely where you live. I suspect he's simply enjoying the excuse to make a spectacle of himself over you." Prudence's eyes softened just slightly. "It's been a long time since anyone made a spectacle over you, hasn't it, love?" Jacinta looked down at her tea and did not answer, because the answer was written plainly enough on her face, and because some truths did not need saying twice. The flowers arrived properly that afternoon. Not roses as it turned out, but a great tangle of blue delphiniums, unfashionable and strange and nothing at all like what a duke was meant to send a lady he was courting. The card read, in a hand that slanted hard and fast across the paper, "They reminded me of you. Difficult to grow and worth the trouble. T. She was still holding the card, foolishly, uselessly pleased, when Reginald found her in the small parlor. "Flowers," he said in the flat voice he used when he had already decided to be angry and was only choosing his opening line. "From Thornhaven, I presume." "Yes." "You will send them back." Jacinta set the card down carefully, buying herself a moment because the old instinct, the 11-year habit of smoothing things over, making herself smaller, agreeing before the argument could properly begin, rose up in her like water finding its old channel. She made herself set it aside. "No," she said. "I don't believe I will." Reginald's face did something complicated. Surprise first, quickly smothered, then the familiar cold contempt settling back into place like a mask returning to a shelf. "You forget yourself, madam. You are still my wife." "I have not forgotten it for a single day of 11 years, my lord." "You've made rather certain of that." She kept her voice even, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were not steady at all. "You called my grief a fading bloom in front of half of London not 4 days past. You have not touched my hand in kindness since before we lost." She stopped, made herself continue. "Since before. And now you wish to forbid me flowers from a man who at least had the decency to notice I was still alive underneath it. This is unbecoming. Perhaps. But it is, for the first time in a very long while, honest." She met his eyes and did not look away, though it cost her something to hold there, something old and frightened that had learned long ago to look at the floor when he used that tone. "You do not want me, Reginald. You have made that abundantly clear for years. What you want is to be certain no one else wants me either. That is not a marriage. I begin to wonder if it ever was." For one long moment he only stared at her, and something moved behind his eyes that she did not recognize. Not quite anger, not quite the cold contempt she knew so well, but something closer to fear, the particular fear of a man watching something he'd thought safely broken begin slowly to mend itself without his permission. "You will regret this," he said finally, and there was no heat in it now, only a quiet and ugly certainty that frightened her more than shouting would have. "A woman in your position cannot afford scandal, Jacinta. I can still make things very difficult for you. You've made things difficult for me since the day I married you, my lord. I find I no longer fear the difference." He left without another word, and she stood alone in the small parlor with the delphiniums filling the air with their strange, sharp scent, her heart going hard and fast in her chest, not with fear exactly, though there was fear tangled through it, but with something that felt dangerously close to hope, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum as though she might hold the feeling still long enough to be certain it was real. Outside, a carriage she did not recognize had stopped across the square, and had been sitting there, she realized with a small and unwilling smile, for the better part of an hour. The Thornhaven townhouse had a garden at its back that no one in London seemed to know existed, tucked behind high brick walls and a door so plain and unremarkable that Jacinta suspected the Duke kept it that way on purpose. A place built for a man who did not wish to be found, and did not wish to be seen wanting anything. He found her waiting there 3 days later, on the stone bench beneath a leaning pear tree, exactly where his note had asked her to be. She had told her maid she was visiting her aunt. She had told her aunt nothing at all, which Prudence had accepted with a knowing look and no comment whatsoever, which was in its way worse than an interrogation would have been. "You came," Thornhaven said, and there was something almost unguarded in his voice, a rawness she hadn't heard from him at the ball, where every word had seemed polished smooth by long practice. "I told myself I would not." She looked up at him, the low autumn sun catching gold in her hair, and found she did not particularly regret the lie she'd told herself. "I appear to be a poor judge of my own resolve these days. A failing I find I'm rather grateful for." He sat beside her, not too close, though she was sharply, foolishly aware of the small space between his sleeve and hers, and how easily it could be closed. "Your husband called on my mother yesterday." Jacinta went still. What did he want? To imply, with as much subtlety as a falling piano, that I had designs on another man's wife and ought to be ashamed of myself. Thornhaven's mouth curved, though there was no real humor in it. My mother told him that shame was not an emotion the Thornhaven men had ever been particularly good at, and offered him another sherry. Despite herself, Jacinta laughed. but it faded quickly because underneath the wit was something colder, something that had followed her out of that small parlor 3 days ago and had not left her since. "He is frightened," she said. "Not of losing me. I don't think he has truly wanted me in years. He is frightened of what people will say if I am seen wanting someone else more." "And are you?" Thornhaven asked, quiet now, all the practiced polish gone out of his voice. "Wanting someone else more?" The question sat between them in the falling light, and Jacinta found she could not answer it lightly, the way she might once have deflected an uncomfortable truth with a clever turn of phrase. Something in his face asked for honesty, plain and unflinching, the same honesty she had given her husband 3 days past, and she found she owed this man at least that much. "I do not know how to want anything anymore," she said low. "I buried that part of myself a long time ago, Your Grace, somewhere around the time I buried my son, and I am not entirely certain it survived the ground." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "You see a woman with steel in her, you said at the ball. Perhaps. But steel is only iron that has been through the fire enough times to stop bending. I am not sure there is anything soft left underneath it for you to want." He turned to look at her fully then, and the low light caught the sharp lines of his face, softened them into something almost unbearably gentle. "I have buried people too, Jacinta." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed somewhere low in her chest, warm and unwelcome and entirely too pleasant. "A wife for years past. Consumption. I have spent every season since being paraded in front of women who wanted my title and were perfectly content to overlook the rest of me, and I let them because it was easier than being truly looked at again." His hand, resting on the bench between them, moved a fraction closer to hers. "I do not want your bloom, Lady Ashworth. I have no use for bloom. I want the iron. I have simply never met anyone before who let me see it." Her breath caught, sharp and sudden, and the space between their hands closed the last inch until his fingers brushed hers, warm through thin cotton gloves, and neither of them pulled away. "This is madness," she whispered. "I am still married. If anyone saw us here—" "No one will see us here." His voice had dropped, low and rough at the edges. "This garden has kept my secrets for 30 years. It can keep one more." He was close now, closer than propriety allowed, close enough that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, could feel the warmth coming off him in the cooling evening air, and every sensible thought in her head, the 11 years of caution, the fear of Reginald's cold fury, the whisper of what people would say, went quiet all at once, the way a room goes quiet before a held breath. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, "and I will." She did not tell him to stop. His hand rose, slow and careful, as though she were something that might startle and vanish if he moved too quickly, and cupped the side of her face, his thumb tracing once along her cheekbone with a tenderness that made something long frozen in her chest crack clean through. She felt herself lean into it before she had decided to, felt her eyes fall closed, felt the whole aching weight of 3 lonely years gather itself into the small distance left between his mouth and hers. And then, from the direction of the townhouse, a door slammed hard, and a voice she recognized with a cold drop of her stomach called out across the garden. "Well," said Reginald Ashworth, stepping through the gate with his hat still in his hand and murder written plain across his face. "Isn't this a very touching scene?" For one terrible frozen moment nobody moved at all. Jacinta's hand was still half raised toward Thornhaven's chest where she had gripped his coat without quite realizing she'd done it, and the Duke had gone very still beside her, the particular stillness of a large animal deciding whether a fight was worth having. "Reginald." Jacinta was on her feet before she decided to stand, putting a careful foot of distance between herself and Thornhaven that did nothing at all to undo what her husband had plainly already seen. "How did you find you?" "It wasn't difficult." Reginald's voice was pleasant in the way a knife is pleasant, right up until it isn't. "Your aunt's footman is remarkably loose-lipped when a man offers him £5 and a sympathetic ear about a worried husband." He walked further into the garden, unhurried, and Jacinta hated how her whole body wanted to shrink from him, 11 years of instinct rising up faster than any new courage could smother it. "Worried husband. That's rather good, isn't it? I quite enjoyed saying it." "Ashworth." Thornhaven had risen too, and his voice had dropped into something low and even more dangerous than Reginald's careful pleasantness. The voice, Jacinta thought distantly, of a man who did not raise his voice because he had never needed to. You will address your wife with some respect, or you will leave this garden without your teeth. My wife. Reginald's eyes flicked to Jacinta, and something ugly moved behind them. Yes. Do let's remember that detail, Your Grace, however inconvenient you find it. Whatever you were about to do just now, and don't imagine I didn't see precisely what I interrupted, you were about to do it to another man's wife. In his own garden, no less. How very bold of you both. What I was about to do, Jacinta said, and was faintly astonished at how steady her own voice came out, is nothing you have any right to be wounded by, Reginald. You stopped being wounded by the loss of me the day you told the whole of Fenwick's drawing room that grief had ruined my looks. I was angry. Men say foolish things when they're angry. You weren't angry. You were bored and cruel, and you wanted an audience to enjoy it with you. She stepped forward out from beside Thornhaven because this argument, at least, was hers alone to have. I have spent 11 years making myself smaller so that you would have less to criticize, and it has never once been enough. I am done, Reginald. I am entirely done. Done. He laughed, short and humorless. You are my wife under God and law, Jacinta, and no amount of fashionable despair will change that. I could ruin you with a single letter to the right newspaper. Adultery, they'll call it, and no jury of decent people will look twice at the difference between what nearly happened and what people will assume happened. You'll lose everything, your standing, your aunt's good name along with yours, any hope of. Enough. Thornhaven's voice cut through the garden like a blade through silk, quiet and absolute, and even Reginald stopped talking. You will not threaten her again in my hearing, Ashworth, or I promise you, the newspapers will have considerably more interesting things to print about you than my conduct in a garden. I know men who owe you money at cards, and men who know exactly how you've been managing your estate's accounts since your father died. I have been remarkably patient about not making use of that knowledge. That patience has limits, and you have just found them. Something in Reginald's face flickered. The fear again, the same fear Jacinta had glimpsed 3 days past in her own parlor. The fear of a small, cruel man realizing the ground beneath him was not nearly as solid as he'd believed. But he rallied, the way such men always did, with venom in place of courage. She is still my wife, he said again, quieter now, and turned that flat, cold gaze on Jacinta. Come home, Jacinta. No. Or don't imagine I won't make good on every word of what I've said. The garden held its breath. Jacinta looked between them. Her husband, familiar and cold and frightening in the particular way only 11 years of marriage could make a person frightening, and Thornhaven, still and steady and watching her with an expression that asked nothing of her at all, made no demand, applied no pressure, only waited as though whatever she chose next was entirely and only hers to choose. And she understood with a clarity that felt almost violent in how suddenly it arrived, that this was the whole of it. Not a choice between two men, whatever Reginald wanted to believe, but a choice between the woman who had spent 11 years disappearing to keep a cruel man comfortable, and whoever she might become if she simply stopped. No, she said. The word landed soft in the cooling evening air, but it landed like a door closing. I beg your pardon? Reginald said. I said no. I will not come home, Reginald, tonight or any night after. Print your letter. Tell your story to whatever newspaper will have you. I find I would rather be ruined and true than safe and hollow for one more year of my life. Her hands were shaking now, she could feel it, but her voice did not shake with them. You took my grief and made it a joke in front of people who mattered to no one. You will not also take the first honest feeling I've had in 3 years and make that a joke too. I won't allow it. Reginald stared at her as though she had struck him, which in her own way she supposed she had. You'll regret this, he said, but the words had gone thin, all the venom drained out of them, and he turned on his heel and left the garden the way he'd come, the gate banging shut behind him hard enough to rattle on its hinges. Silence fell, thick and strange, and Jacinta became abruptly, painfully aware that she was shaking all over, the way a person shakes after nearly stepping into traffic and only realizing the danger once it has passed. Thornhaven's arms came around her before she had quite finished swaying, And she let herself be held, let herself press her face against the solid warmth of his chest and simply breathe for a long moment, while the pear tree dropped a single leaf, slow and unhurried, onto the stone bench where they'd nearly kissed. "He will do it," she whispered into his coat. "The letter. He will try to ruin me. Let him try." Thornhaven's hand moved slow and steady over her hair. "I told you, Jacinta. I have never needed to raise my voice because I have never needed to bluff. Whatever he prints, I will answer, and I promise you I will not lose." She pulled back just far enough to look up at him, and found his face very close to hers again, the moment from before hanging unfinished in the air between them like a held note waiting to resolve. "And if he does ruin me anyway?" she asked. "If society casts me out entirely?" "Then," Thornhaven said low, "you will simply have to marry a duke instead, and let him deal with the consequences of loving a woman worth the scandal." The letter came as Reginald had promised 4 days later, not to a newspaper first as it happened, but to Jacinta's own townhouse, delivered by a solicitor with an apologetic face and a document that accused her, in cold legal language, of conduct unbecoming a wife, cruelty of temperament, and, the phrase that made her hands go cold as she read it, abandonment of the marital home. "He is asking for the divorce himself," Prudence said, reading over her shoulder with her spectacles pushed low on her nose. "The gall of the man. He humiliates you for 3 years, finds you at last happy, and then acts the wounded party in the papers. Let him." Jacinta set the letter down with hands that, to her own quiet surprise, did not shake at all. "I want the divorce every bit as much as he does, Aunt. I simply did not expect he would be the one brave enough to ask for it first. Brave has nothing to do with it. He knows Thornhaven has him cornered over his gambling debts and wants to appear the injured husband before the truth of his accounts comes out some other way." Prudence folded her arms. "Still, it will be ugly, Jassy. Divorce always is. There will be talk for a full season at least, and some doors that never open to you again." "I have spent 11 years behind doors that were never truly open to me either, Aunt. I find I can bear a few more closings so long as the right one stays." The trial, when it came, was mercifully brief and thoroughly unglamorous. A grey room, a tired judge, Reginald's solicitor reading out complaints about her conduct in a flat voice that seemed to bore even Reginald himself. Thornhaven sat 2 rows behind her the entire time, not permitted to speak, forbidden by every rule of decorum from so much as approaching her, and yet she felt him there the whole while, steady as a held hand. It was Prudence who did the talking that mattered, marching to the witness box in her second-best bonnet and informing the court, with the flat certainty of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and feared exactly no one in a wig, that she had watched her niece grow thinner and grayer and quieter for 11 years under Baron Ashworth's roof, and that whatever the Baron wished to call abandonment she called survival, and she would say so to the judge's face as many times as required. It was enough. Barely, and only after a fortnight's agonizing wait for the ruling, but it was enough. The marriage was dissolved on grounds neither party contested very hard, and Reginald Ashworth removed himself from London for the country within the month, his accounts, as Thornhaven had quietly predicted, no longer bearing close inspection by anyone who mattered. Jacinta did not attend his departure. She spent that particular afternoon in the garden behind the plain brick door instead, sitting on the same stone bench beneath the same pear tree, now bare of leaves and rimed faintly with the season's first frost, waiting for a man who was, for once, late. "You're smiling," Thornhaven said when he finally found her there, breathless from whatever business had kept him, shrugging out of his greatcoat as he sat. "I don't believe I've seen you smile without guarding it first. I am no longer married to a baron who calls my grief a fading bloom in front of Lord Fenwick." She turned to look at him properly, and found her heart doing something entirely undignified at the mere sight of his face, familiar now in a way she had not let herself expect to feel about any man again. "I find that leaves rather a lot of room for smiling." "Good." He took her hand, plain and unhurried, thumb moving once over her knuckles. "Because I have a question to ask you, and I find I would rather you were smiling when I asked it." Her breath caught, sharp and sudden, the way it had that evening in this very garden, the moment left unfinished for weeks now, aching quietly in the back of her mind every night since. "Your Grace." "Marcus," he said. "If you are about to answer a question I haven't yet asked, you might at least use my name while you do it." "Marcus," she said, and the word felt strange and warm in her mouth. A small intimacy she had not been permitted in 11 years of marriage to another man. "Ask then." He did not kneel, which she was faintly, ridiculously grateful for. Some performance of romance she did not think either of them had the patience for tonight. He only turned fully toward her on the bench, his hand tightening around hers, his eyes steady and dark and entirely without the practiced polish he wore for the rest of the world. "I told you once I had no use for bloom," he said. "That I wanted the iron instead. I find I was wrong, Jacinta. I want both. I want the woman who cuts a cruel man down with a single sentence at a ball, and I want the woman who cried in this garden 3 days before that, and I want every quiet, frightened, furious, laughing version of you that exists between the two. Marry me. Not to silence gossip, not to settle debts, not for any reason at all except that I have spent 4 years since my wife died believing I would never again want to be truly known by anyone, and then you sat down on this bench and proved me wrong within the hour." The frost-touched garden held very still around them, and Jacinta felt the whole long ache of the last 3 years gather itself up in her chest and for the first time, find somewhere warm to land instead of somewhere to hide. "Yes," she said simply, the word costing her nothing at all this time, no calculation, no fear, no old instinct to make herself smaller before she gave it. "Yes, Marcus. I will marry you." His hand came up to cradle her jaw the way it had that first evening, and this time nothing slammed through the garden gate to stop what came next. He leaned in slow, unhurried, as though he had all the time left in the world to do this exact thing, and when his mouth finally met hers it was soft at first, careful, a question answered gently, and then not so careful at all, his other hand rising to tangle in the loose curl of hair at her temple, and Jacinta felt the whole cold weight of 11 years dissolve somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, felt herself kissed the way she had once believed she was too worn through, too grieved, too iron all the way down to ever be kissed again. They were married the following spring, quietly, in a small church outside London with Prudence weeping loudly into a handkerchief and pretending she was not, and Jacinta wore blue delphiniums instead of roses, because some things once given were worth keeping. She never did find out what became of Reginald's letter to the newspapers. She found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she no longer cared to ask. The end. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us here in Lucia's drawing room. If Jacinta's story made you ache, made you smile, or made you believe a little more in second chances, please show it some love. Like this story, leave a comment telling me which act broke your heart the most, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale waiting for you here. Until next time, my dears, keep believing in the scandalous, the tender, and the true.